The silence of space was absolute, a cold, suffocating emptiness that pressed on the minds of the crew aboard the exploration vessel Starbound Zenith. The ship's hull groaned as it drifted through the void, its sleek silver body illuminated only by the distant glow of a blue star. Inside, tension hung thick in the air. Lieutenant Darius Kane stood at the center of the bridge, his jaw clenched, eyes locked on the main view screen. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of command pressing heavier than his armored suit. Every breath felt too loud. Every second too long. Across the screen was an anomaly unlike anything they had seen before, a massive, obsidian-black object, its surface rippling like oil on water. It hovered in space, motionless but alive with an unnatural hum that resonated through the Zenith's metal frame. This wasn't on the star maps, muttered Ensign Reese, his hands dancing nervously over the sensor controls. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his eyes darting from one screen to the next. It just appeared, Lieutenant. No FTL signature. No detectable mass displacement. It's just, here. Objects that size don't just appear, Ensign, Kane snapped, his gaze never leaving the screen. His voice was sharp, honed from years of command, but there was a flicker of doubt buried beneath his words. Run a full spectral scan. I want to know what it's made of, how it got here, and if it's a threat. Reese nodded frantically, his fingers tapping commands with growing urgency. The display blinked with lines of data, but something was wrong. The readings were blank. No heat. No radiation. No reflection of electromagnetic signals. It wasn't just invisible to sensors, it was nothing. Negative returns, sir, Reese stammered, leaning forward as if being closer to the screen would change the result. It's absorbing everything we send. No reflection, no refraction, it's like it doesn't exist. It exists, Kane muttered, his eyes narrowing. And it's watching us. Lieutenant, said a low, calm voice from the rear of the bridge. Dr. Ilara Voss, the ship's xenobiologist, approached slowly, her gaze fixed on the anomaly. Her face was pale but composed, her silver-gray hair tied back in a loose braid. She had seen enough unexplainable things in her career to know that fear came second to observation. This structure, it's not natural. Look at the patterns on its surface. Those grooves, the symmetry, this is designed. Designed by who? Kane asked, already knowing the answer. His fingers curled into fists. Ilara's eyes met his. She didn't blink. Someone who knew we'd be here. The moment her words left her lips, the anomaly shifted. It didn't move in the traditional sense. It didn't rotate or accelerate. It simply changed position, like a frame skip in a broken video. One moment it was in front of them, the next, it was closer. Contact! Reese's voice cracked, his fingers smashing emergency proximity alerts. Klaxons blared, red lights flashing across the bridge. It's moving! It's moving directly toward us. Helm, hard reverse. Kane barked. Get us clear of that thing, now. The ship's thrusters roared to life, pushing the starbound Zenith back, but the anomaly followed with impossible precision, matching their retreat step for step. It didn't accelerate, it simply was closer. The crew's movements became frantic, every officer gripping their stations as the ship shuddered under sudden fluctuations in gravitational force. Gravitational anomaly detected. Reese shouted. It's pulling us in. Kane's eyes darted to the viewport. He could see it now, not just a shadow but a shape. Sharp, jagged protrusions like obsidian blades jutted out from its surface, twisting in fractal patterns that hurt to look at for too long. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a rock. It was something worse. Emergency thrusters. Kane roared. Burn it all. I don't care if we lose fuel. Break us free. Engaging emergency thrust, barked Helmsman Ortega, slamming his hand down on the ignition control. The ship bucked violently, lurching as twin bursts of blue flame shot from the ray engines. The crew were thrown forward, their harnesses straining to hold them in place. Kane braced himself against the captain's chair, teeth clenched against the pressure. For a moment, it seemed to work. The ship pulled away, putting distance between them and the anomaly. The flashing proximity warnings dimmed. Reese let out a long breath, his hands trembling over the controls. Did we lose it? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Hold position, Kane ordered, his breathing heavy. His eyes flicked to Ilara, but she was still staring at the screen, her face blank with dread. No, she said quietly. It didn't follow us. It never had to. What are you talking about, Doctor? Kane asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Her eyes widened as she slowly turned to face him. It's not following us, Lieutenant. It's mirroring us. The bridge lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the power surged, cutting every screen to black. Silence. Then, the sound. A low, guttural thrum echoed from the walls, a noise that had no source but was felt in the bones. The sound rose in intensity, like a massive horn blast heard underwater. It wasn't just noise. It was language. Something's coming through the comms. Reese yelped, tapping on the console to trace the signal. It's not ours, it's piggybacking on our frequency. Shut it down, Kane snapped. Kill the link. I'm trying. Reese's fingers flew, but his eyes went wide with horror. It's not letting me. It's broadcasting back to us. The sound shifted, changing pitch. The words were there now, faint at first but growing more distinct. A voice, deep and layered, like the grinding of stone against metal. The words came slowly. We see you. The bridge lights flickered again, and the anomaly reappeared on every screen. But now, it was different. It wasn't a black object anymore. It was a shape. No longer distant, no longer alien. It was now a silhouette. A figure. Human. The figure tilted its head slowly, as though studying them. Lieutenant, Ilara whispered, her voice cracking. It's copying us. Stay calm, Kane said, though his heart was thudding so hard he thought it might break his ribs. His hands hovered over the manual override. If it came to it, he'd blow the reactor and eject the core before letting whatever this was get into the ship. Sir, Ortega's voice was barely audible. It's not copying us. It's becoming us. The screens turned to static, flickering with images, but not random ones. Faces. Crew faces. Their faces. Kane's face. Reese's face. Ilara's face. Faces twisted and warped into unnatural grins, eyes hollow, mouths stretched wide as if caught in a silent scream. We are here. The lights went out. Total darkness. Total silence. Kane's breathing was loud in his ears. He drew his sidearm, his eyes darting to the emergency flashlight on his belt. Slowly, he pulled it free, clicked it on. The light illuminated the room in a narrow beam, cutting through the pitch black. Reese was gone. His chair was empty, the straps hanging loose. Reese! Kane called, his breath fogging in the cold air. No response. His flashlight panned left. No Ortega. No Ilara. Only him. Alone. No. Not alone. The beam stopped on the far side of the bridge, where the shadows were thickest. Slowly, too slowly, something moved. It stepped forward. A figure. Human in shape. But the eyes, they weren't eyes. They were voids. Empty. Hollow. It tilted its head the same way the shape had done before. It smiled. We are you. The flashlight flickered. Kane's breath caught in his throat. His fingers moved to the emergency purge switch. His last command echoed in his mind. If it gets in, eject everything. He pressed it. The last thing he saw was his own face, grinning back at him. The starbound Zenith floated in the vast abyss of space, its hull lined with fresh scorch marks from the emergency burn. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of backup systems, the steady pulse of warning beacons flashing red across every corridor. Lieutenant Kane moved swiftly, his footsteps heavy on the metal grating. The flickering emergency lights cast long, jagged shadows that danced with every movement. Every shadow now felt suspect. Every creak of the hull, every hum of the machinery, felt like something breathing. His comlink crackled. Lieutenant, come in, came the whispery voice of Dr. Ilara Voss. Static followed, making her voice sound distant, warped. I'm in the med bay. Reese is, his not responding. I don't know what happened. He just froze. Stay put, Doctor, Kane replied, his grip tightening on his sidearm. Keep all entrances sealed. I'm on my way. Lieutenant, her voice grew sharp with urgency. You don't understand. He's not unconscious, he's awake. But he's not moving. He's just staring at me. Kane stopped mid-stride. A chill ran down his spine. He's paralyzed. Not exactly, she whispered. It's like he's listening. Listening to something I can't hear. His pulse quickened. He glanced behind him, scanning the empty corridor. Stay on comms, Doctor. Don't let him out of your sight. He continued forward, his eyes flicking to every shadow, every open vent. Something wasn't right. It was too quiet. The ambient hum of the ship's systems was missing a familiar undertone, the white noise of electrical currents that ran through every wall. His ears strained for it, but all he could hear was his own breathing. Then, faintly, from the far end of the corridor, came a tap, tap, tap. Kane froze. His breath caught in his chest. Slowly, he raised his flashlight and aimed it down the hall. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only an empty corridor lined with pipes and panels. The tapping stopped. He took a step forward, his gun raised, his flashlight beam steady. Another tap. Closer this time. Not metal on metal. It sounded like fingertips on glass. "Vus," he said into the comm, his voice low. "Do you hear that?" Her response came through as static, distorted and broken. "What? Here. Kane, get to, fast." "Repeat that," he said, his eyes still locked on the corridor ahead. "It's looking at me, Lieutenant." Her voice was strained, trembling. "It's not Reese anymore." His blood went cold. He bolted down the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. His boots echoed in sync with his racing pulse. "Hold on, Doctor, I'm coming." The lights flickered again. Not the rhythmic flicker of a damaged power relay, this was a pulse, like the blink of an eye. The corridor went dark for a single heartbeat, then came back to life. When the light returned, something was wrong. The walls looked the same. The vents looked the same. But something about the air felt heavier, like the atmosphere had shifted ever so slightly. He could smell it now, faint, acrid, like burned plastic mixed with saltwater. The ship's AI, Sarah, suddenly chimed in, her voice calm but cold. "Unidentified life form detected. Deck 3, Medical Bay. Override emergency lockdown." Kane barked, sprinting toward the med bay. "Seal Deck 3, Section B. No access except for command authorization. Unable to comply." "What do you mean, unable to comply?" he snarled, leaping down a flight of stairs. "The anomaly is interfacing with navigation protocols. Manual override required at Central Console." Kane cursed under his breath. The anomaly wasn't just following them, it was inside the ship. He rounded the final corner leading to the med bay door. It was closed, red lights blinking overhead. He tapped the control panel, but it buzzed with denial. "Vus, I'm outside. Open the hatch." Silence. "Vus, do you hear me?" Nothing. He glanced through the small, reinforced glass window of the med bay door. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered in short bursts. His flashlight beam barely penetrated the haze of mist hanging in the air. He could see the two medical pods on the far wall. One was open and empty. The other was shut tight, condensation fogging the glass. Movement. His breath caught. A figure stood at the edge of his view, just outside the circle of light cast by the flickering ceiling lamp. He squinted, peering closer. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was Reese. His eyes were wide open, but his pupils were pinpricks. His face was slack, his mouth slightly open. His head turned unnaturally slow, his neck creaking like old wood under strain. Reese stared directly at Kane. He smiled. Not a normal smile. No. It was too wide. His lips pulled back far enough to expose every tooth in his mouth, his gums pale and dry. His eyes didn't blink. "Vus," Kane said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you're in there, answer me right now." The response wasn't from Vus. It wasn't even from the comms. It came from Reese. "Lieutenant," Reese said, his voice layered, hollow, and wrong. "She's not here anymore." Kane's heart stopped. His mouth went dry. He stumbled back from the door, his weapon raised, his eyes locked on Reese. His former crewmate tilted his head in that familiar, predatory way. "Stop playing games," Kane barked, forcing the quiver out of his voice. "Where is she?" Reese's body shifted, twitching in quick, unnatural jerks, like a marionette with tangled strings. His head tilted the other way. Crack. His neck twisted too far. "She is with us." Those words sent a shudder through Kane's bones. It wasn't just Reese talking. It was something inside him. The lights flickered again. Darkness. Then light. And now. Reese was closer. He hadn't moved. Not in the way normal people moved. There was no step, no lunge. He was simply closer. Like he had always been standing there. Kane stumbled back, his breathing rapid, his eyes darting for an escape route. He slammed his hand on the emergency override. "Manual override required," Sarah's voice echoed again, calm as ever. "Forget manual override," Kane yelled, his heart racing. "Purging med bay containment, initiate. Command authorization required." "Kane 497, he barked. The system beeped once. The sound of decompressing air hissed as the emergency purge sequence began. The red lights spun faster, warning sirens blaring. Reese didn't react. He didn't scream. Didn't move. He only smiled wider. As the vacuum seal engaged, Kane saw it. Just for a moment. Not Reese. Not Reese at all. The fog in the room shifted, coiling unnaturally around him. It twisted in ways fog shouldn't twist. Then it peeled back, revealing something beneath it. It wasn't human. The face was smooth. Too smooth. No eyes, no nose, only a smooth plane of grayish flesh. No features. Just a mouth. A mouth that stretched from one side of its head to the other. It looked at him. The lights flickered once more, and now it was at the window. Not behind it. At it. Kane gasped, stumbling backward, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. The shape pressed a featureless face against the glass, its too wide mouth splitting open, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth. "We see you, Kane." He spun on his heels and ran. He ran like a man who had seen death itself. The emergency klaxons echoed behind him. The lights flickered once more. And then, for just a second, no more than a heartbeat, he heard it. The tapping. On glass. But this time, it was right behind him. Kane's lungs burned as he sprinted through the dimly lit corridors of the starbound zenith, the sharp clang of his boots reverberating off the metal walls. His heart was a war drum in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. The emergency lights pulsed red like a heartbeat, illuminating the hole in flashes that made every shadow seem to lunge toward him. His fingers gripped his sidearm so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Every instinct screamed run faster. Behind him, the tapping returned. No longer a soft, patient tap. This was frantic, relentless, like claws raking across metal. Tap 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 tap. It was faster now, keeping pace with him. He glanced back for just a second. His breath caught in his throat. The thing wasn't running. It wasn't chasing him in any way a living thing should. It skittered, its limbs moving too fast, too disjointed, like a glitching hologram. Every flicker of light caught its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally long before snapping back. It was no longer hiding in Reese's form. It was something raw, a shape that didn't belong in the geometry of the universe. It bent where it shouldn't bend. Its face, if it could even be called that, was smooth, except for that horrific, unending smile. "We see you, Kane." The words echoed from the walls, not from behind him, not from his comms, from everywhere. He pushed his legs harder, ignoring the burn in his thighs. His mind was a storm of panic, his training struggling to surface through the flood of terror. Find cover. Find containment. Regain control. But there was no cover. No containment. It was everywhere. He dashed past the hydroponics bay, barely catching a glimpse of the glass-walled garden inside. The plants twisted unnaturally, their leaves curling like fingers reaching for him. He cursed under his breath. It wasn't just him. The ship was changing. The corridors felt tighter. The doors seemed farther apart. His gaze flickered toward the ceiling vents. One of them hung open, its grate dangling by a single bolt. Black sludge dripped from the edge, forming tiny splatters on the floor. He kept running. Don't look back. Don't look up. Just keep moving. The comlink buzzed in his ear, and for a brief second, he heard a familiar voice. Lieutenant, help, please. It was Dr. Voss. Her voice was faint, but it was her. Voss, he barked, his eyes darting left and right, scanning for an access hatch. Where are you? I thought you were in the med bay. Her voice cracked with static. I don't know. I think it's inside my head. His heart clenched. Stay calm. Focus on your surroundings. Are you in a corridor? Do you see any? Her scream cut through the comms like a knife. Not a scream of fear, a scream of pure agony. The noise pierced his ear, sharp and metallic, like feedback from an old speaker. He yanked the comlink from his ear, breathing hard, his eyes darting around the hallway. Her scream echoed, warping into something hollow, wrong. The scream became a laugh. Then the laugh dissolved into static. Voss, answer me. He pressed the comlink back to his ear. Answer me, damn it. She's not here anymore, Lieutenant, the voice replied. It wasn't Voss. It wasn't anyone human. He stopped in his tracks, panting hard, scanning every shadow in the corridor. The voice came from all directions. The tapping started again. Tap, 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 tap. It was closer now. So much closer. His breath fogged the air in front of him. The temperature was dropping. He could see frost forming on the metal walls, creeping outward like veins of ice. His breath was shallow, his fingers stiff from the cold. Come on, he muttered, turning toward the central access panel on the wall. His fingers danced over the controls, trying to access the ship's emergency lockdown protocols. Come on, sir. Don't fail me now. Manual override required. He gritted his teeth. Override authorization, Kane 497 Delta. Processing. The tapping stopped. Kane's fingers hovered over the panel, his breath fogging the screen. Slowly, he glanced over his shoulder. Nothing but an empty corridor. The emergency lights pulsed red. On. Off. On. Off. He swallowed hard, slowly turning back to the console. Sir, lock all bulkhead doors. Full containment. Containment protocol initiated. He exhaled a breath of relief as he heard the hiss of hydraulics echo down the ship's spine. The sound of every bulkhead locking shut was like music to his ears. He leaned his head against the console, eyes closed, heart still pounding. Then, the tapping returned. But this time, it wasn't behind him. It wasn't from the ceiling. It was inside the wall. He stepped back from the console, eyes wide, pulse racing again. His breath caught in his chest as he stared at the metal panel. The tapping was right there, just behind the thin layer of alloy. Slowly, he reached for his weapon, holding it with both hands. The tapping grew louder. Tap, 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 tap. Then, bang. He flinched. Another bang. Louder this time. The whole panel rattled. Bang. 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 It wasn't tapping anymore. It was pounding. Sir, he whispered, his voice cracking. Report anomaly location. Life form detected. Proximity, 2 meters. His heart stopped. He was 2 meters from the wall. Slowly, he took a step back, his gun trained on the panel. The banging stopped. Silence. His ears strained to hear anything in the oppressive quiet. His breath felt too loud. His heartbeat sounded like thunder. Then, he heard it. So close. So close it could have been right behind his ear. Kane, it whispered, its voice low, wet, and broken, like someone speaking through a shattered speaker. We're inside. He spun, gun raised, finger on the trigger, but there was no one there. No movement. Nothing but the corridor behind him. His eyes darted to every vent, every shadow, every crevice. The lights flickered once. Just once. He heard the hiss of air escaping, faint but distinct. He turned back toward the wall panel. It was open. The metal panel hung loose on one side, swaying gently. The hollow space behind it was pitch black. No, he whispered, stepping back. No, 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 no. The darkness inside the wall wasn't normal. It wasn't the absence of light. It was a void. Pure and unnatural. It didn't fade into gray like a shadow, it was absolute black. Then, slowly, something stepped out. At first, it was just a limb. Long, thin, and smooth as porcelain, ending in sharp, dagger-like fingers. Another limb followed. Its movements were wrong, stuttering, like a frame of video stuck in a loop. A head emerged. It didn't have a face. Just smooth flesh. But a mouth formed, a wide mouth that spread from one side of its face to the other, filled with needle-sharp teeth. It smiled, stretching the corners of its mouth far beyond human anatomy. Kane's breath caught in his throat. His finger twitched on the trigger, but he couldn't move. The creature's head tilted slowly, as if it were examining him. "Do you see us now, Lieutenant?" it said, the voice of 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other. He stumbled backward, gun raised, but his fingers felt like lead. "We've been watching since the beginning," Kane screamed. He didn't know if it was from rage or terror. He fired. Once. Twice. 3 times. The gunfire echoed through the hall. When the smoke cleared, the corridor was empty. The wall was intact. The tapping was gone. His comlink crackled to life. "Lieutenant." It was Voss. "Are you there?" Kane raised the comlink to his ear, his breath trembling. "Yeah," he whispered. "I'm here." "Good," Voss replied. But it wasn't her voice. It was them. Kane's breathing was ragged, each exhale sharp like a blade cutting through the cold, metallic air of the starbound zenith. His eyes darted around the dim corridor, sweat mixing with the frost that had crept over the walls. His body ached from exhaustion, every muscle pulled taut like a cord ready to snap. He hadn't stopped moving since the encounter with it. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. It wasn't Voss. It wasn't anything that belonged in this reality. The ship groaned, a deep, guttural sound that echoed from the bowels of the vessel, as if the metal hull itself was shifting. He pressed his back against the cold wall, eyes fixated on the far end of the corridor, where the shadows pulsed with the flickering red emergency lights. On. Off. On. Off. Each flash revealed a glimpse of the corridor ahead, but with every off, the darkness grew heavier. Denser. It wasn't just darkness anymore. It had presence. "Sarah," Kane whispered, his voice barely audible, his breath forming foggy puffs in the cold air. "Status of life form signatures." "Multiple life forms detected," Sarah replied with an eerie calm. 2 life forms registered in the med bay. 4 life forms in cargo bay 7. 1 life form in. She paused. Kane's heart began to pound. "No. Don't say it." 1 life form detected in close proximity. He spun, gun raised, eyes wide with panic. But there was nothing. No tapping. No skittering. Just the hum of the ship's dying systems. Slowly, he turned back, his breath short and shallow. "Specify location of life form in close proximity," he whispered, feeling the words stick in his throat. "Directly behind you." The blood drained from his face. Cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck. For a moment, his entire body locked up. His nerves refused to respond. His instincts screamed move, but fear had its claws buried too deep in his mind. A single breath brushed past his ear. Slow. Hollow. Freezing. "Run, Kane," the voice coiled around his name, stretching it, warping it. It didn't just speak, it seeped into him. He didn't think. He moved. Kane bolted down the corridor, his legs fueled by raw panic. His gun was useless now. Bullets wouldn't stop something that could be anywhere. His boots slammed against the metal floor, the clangs blending with his own pounding heart. His lungs burned, his vision narrowed. The emergency lights flickered faster now, every flash making the world seem more fragmented. The tapping started again. Tap 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 tap. But it wasn't behind him. It was ahead. He skidded to a halt, almost losing his balance. His breath came in gasps, his hands trembling, gun raised toward the source of the sound. Nothing. The hallway stretched ahead, a long, empty corridor. But the tapping didn't stop. Tap 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 tap. It echoed from the walls, the ceiling, and the floor beneath his feet. His gaze dropped slowly. His heart skipped a beat. The frost on the floor was moving. Tiny cracks spread like spiderwebs, growing wider and deeper. From one of the cracks, Black sludge oozed out, bubbling like tar. Kane stumbled back, his breathing shallow. No, 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 he muttered, shaking his head. This isn't real. It's not real. The crack widened. A finger, long, thin, and smooth as porcelain, emerged from the fissure. Its sharp, dagger-like nail scratched the metal floor as it pulled itself upward. Slowly, another hand followed. Then the arms. Long, too long for anything natural. It pushed itself up, pulling a head through the crack, its featureless face smooth as polished stone. Slowly, it twisted its neck toward him. The mouth formed. The smile stretched from ear to ear, if it had ears. Kane didn't wait. He sprinted down the corridor, his chest heaving with every breath. His muscles burned with every step, but he pushed harder. He had to get to the bridge. If he could reach the bridge, he could eject the reactor core. It would kill everything aboard the ship, including him, but at least they wouldn't get out. Kane, the voice called from the air itself, following him like a shadow. Where are you going, Kane? We only want to see you. We only want to be with you. He reached a bulkhead and slammed his hand against the manual override panel. Sir, open bridge access. Access denied. Authorization required. Authorization. Kane 497 Delta, he shouted, smacking the panel again. Processing. The tapping grew louder. Closer. It was no longer the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of before. It was pounding. Bang. 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 It wasn't just behind him anymore. It was all around him. It was on the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It came from every direction. Authorization accepted. Opening bridge access. The door hissed open. Kane darted through, his heart on the verge of bursting. As soon as he crossed the threshold, he slammed his hand on the lockdown control. The bulkhead doors slid shut with a thud, followed by the sweet, mechanical hiss of the airlock seals engaging. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Silence. Finally, silence. His eyes scanned the bridge. The consoles flickered, some of them glitching with static. Frost coated the edges of the viewport, and beyond it, the black void of space stared back at him, endless and unforgiving. His gaze locked onto the emergency reactor control panel. It was his last chance. If he ejected the core, it would end everything. His body felt like lead as he dragged himself toward the console. Each movement was a battle. His fingers hovered over the terminal, ready to initiate the override. Warning: reactor core ejection will result in catastrophic hull breach. Yeah, he muttered, pressing the override code. That's the point. He entered the final sequence, his fingers trembling. The countdown began. 60 seconds to ejection. The low hum of the reactor intensified as it prepared for release. Kane, the voice returned. It was closer. Too close. He whipped his head around. It was standing right in front of him. No flickering lights. No shadows. Just there. Face to face. The smooth, featureless head tilted slightly, as if curious. The smile was wider now, teeth sharp and jagged. Why run? We were always with you, from the start. Kane clenched his teeth. His fingers hovered over the emergency ejection button. 15 seconds left. Don't do it, Kane. Its voice was gentle now, like a mother comforting a child. You'll be alone. Don't you want to see what's on the other side? We can show you. His eyes locked on the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt something shift inside him, a moment of hesitation. His mind began to blur, his will crumbling like sand. The countdown hit 10 seconds. Don't press it, Kane. Stay. We'll make it painless. We promise. The voice wasn't alien anymore. It was familiar. It was Voss's voice. Kane blinked. His fingers hovered. His breath trembled. His eyes darted between the ejection button and the creature. 5 seconds. Please, Kane, Voss's voice whispered, soft as a lullaby. We're all here. Waiting for you. Just stay. He saw them then. Their faces. Voss. Reese. Lewis. Their faces stared back at him from the smooth, porcelain surface of the creature's skin. All of them smiling. His eyes filled with tears. His fingers trembled. His heart broke. 3 seconds. He closed his eyes. He whispered, "Not today." He slammed his hand on the button. The reactor core shot free from the ship, glowing like a miniature sun. The resulting explosion lit up the void of space, brighter than any star. For a moment, it seemed as if starbound Zenith itself had become a beacon in the darkness. The creature's smile vanished. The light consumed everything. Then, there was only silence. And darkness.